Hi guys, in this video we're going to be learning about arrays and how to use them in Java. So arrays in Java allow us to store a collection of data within a single variable. Let's start by declaring an array. Back in our application class, within the main method, I'm going to type out int array, which is signified by the square brackets, and it's going to be an array of student grades. So we declare it with our type, which is an int array, variable name, student grades. And now we're going to instantiate it. So we're going to say new int array, semicolon. The final thing that we need to do when we declare the new int array is we have to give it a size. So you have to give it a size, and that size will remain fixed. So I'm going to give it a size of 3. This array, or this variable, will hold 3 separate grades. So rather than us individually typing int grade A equals 60, int grade B equals 45, and so on, we're not going to use separate variables. We're going to store them all within a single variable in the form of a list or an array. We've declared and instantiated an array. Now let's populate that array with some data. This array has 3 spaces to store data. We add data to the array based on the index of the array. So this student grades array has 3 spaces, so it has 3 index values, and those indexes start from 0. So we have index 0, index 1, and index 2, and these are basically the addresses of each area of memory for the student grades. So for example, student grades 0 equals 66, student grades 1 equals 78, and student grades 2 equals 91. So as we said, the student grades array has 3 spaces within it because we've set a value of 3 here, and that is the size of the array. At position 0 in the array, we're giving it a value of 66. At position 1 in the array, we're giving it a value of 77, and position 2 in the array, we're giving it a value of 91. So when you're starting out with arrays, it's quite a common error to use 1 as the initial index value. But because of the fact that we use 0-based indexing, that means that we start with an index of 0, not of 1. So we would not do 1, 2, and 3. Because the size of the array is 3, we start with 0, which means that if we try to access student grades at address or index number 3, that won't exist, because there is no value at position 3. There's only values at position 0, 1, and 2. So I'm going to change these back, 0, 1, 2. And on the right hand side here, these are the actual grades. So these are the values that we're storing at these particular addresses of 0, 1, and 2. The next thing we'll do is we're going to print out each of the values. Sout, value at position 0, concatenator, and then we're going to type student grades 0. I'm going to copy this line 2 times, and I'm going to do that with Command D on my keyboard. So this is an IntelliJ feature that allows you to take a line and copy it to the next line. But your cursor simply has to be somewhere on that line. So as long as my cursor is on the line, I can create as many as I want to. But we're just going to stick with these 3 because we have 3 values. I'm going to change this one to 1 and this one to 2. And the same for this one. So student grades 1 and student grades 2. We're simply going to print out, as we said, the value at each of the positions. And we do that by accessing the array by its index value. We know that we're storing 66 at position 0, we're storing 78 at position 1, and we're storing 91 at position 2. So let's run the application. And you can see we print out each of the values. So position 0, we print out 66, position 1, we print out 78, and position 2, we print out 91. So this is a basic example of instantiating an array, populating the array, and retrieving data from the array. We can set up this array in a slightly different way. If, for example, you know what particular student grades you want as we create the array, then you can set them up and instantiate them with the declaration of the array. I can change this to be curly brackets, end it with a semicolon, and within that I can type 66, 78, 91, 56, for example. And then we can remove these lines because these lines are basically doing exactly the same thing. Here we're manually saying at position 0 at 66 and position 1 at 78 and position 2 at 91, whereas the line above simply does it all in one. So this will work exactly the same way, but note how we're not actually setting a particular value for the size of the array, and that's because by default this will have an array size of 4. So we still cannot change the array, we can't increase it or decrease it, but it's set with a value of 4 as the size of the array. So now you'll notice that we've added one more here. We've added a score of 56. So I'm going to go to line number 8 here, so value at position 2, and I'm going to hit Command D on my keyboard. I'm going to change this to 3, and I'm going to change that to 3. I'm going to run the application again, and you can see it still prints out everything exactly the same, but now we have them instantiated on a single line. And as we said before, the array has a size of 4 because there are 4 elements that we're instantiating, automatically giving this array a size of 4. So you can see here on our system out print lines, we're accessing each of the 4 student grades. But what about if I attempted to access the 5th, which doesn't exist? So let's copy the line again. I'm going to say value at position 4, and I'm going to change this to 4. And as we said, 4 is not the 4th item in the array, it's actually the 5th, because we use 0-based indexing. We start from 0, we don't start from 1. So let's run this application, and you can see here that it's come up with a lot of red text, and that's basically an error. So if I click on Java tutorial application main here, and I move up, you can see here that the value position 0, 1, 2, and 3 are all printed out exactly as they were before. But now we get an error. So this is also in Java, this is also known as an exception. We will talk more about exceptions at a later date. But for now, we get an exception or an error, and this is an array index out of bounds exception at position 4. So this is basically saying that we're accessing a particular index or an address, position 4, on the student grades variable, which doesn't exist. And because it doesn't exist, it throws an exception, and more specifically, an array index out of bounds exception. In other words, the index itself is out of bounds, it's outside of what is available within the student grades array. Now let's remove this final line here for position 4. So we've tried this array with ints. Let's try it with something different. So now instead of student grades, we're going to do it with student names. So I'm going to change this from student grades to student names. And of course names don't use ints, they're not numbers, they are characters, a set of characters. So I'm going to change this with string. And this will work in exactly the same way. We have a string array of student names. And you'll see that as we try to instantiate it, this doesn't compile. We get red underlines for each of these values here, and that's because we're declaring a string array, in other words, characters within quotation marks, but we're instantiating it with ints or integers. So we need to change these with the student names. So let's say James, John, Amy, and Rebecca. So we've declared an array of student names of type string array, and we're instantiating them here. James, John, Amy, and Rebecca. And we're going to print them out to the console in exactly the same way as we did before. You'll notice here how we still have student grades, which is why they're highlighted in red, because this variable doesn't exist anymore. We changed it to be called student names. So I'm going to click that, select it, hit Command C on my keyboard, highlight the student grades, and hit Command V. So it's just a copy and paste. I'm now going to run the application, and you can see value at position 0, James, John, Amy, and Rebecca. So arrays can be used for pretty much any data type. One final thing that we can do with arrays, whether it's string arrays, double arrays, int arrays, whatever, we can print out the length. So I'm going to add a final system out print line statement, and I'm just going to type s out, hit enter, length of array, or I might change this to number of students, because that's basically the same thing. Concatenator, student names, dot, and you can see the first option that IntelliJ provides is length. And if I hit Command on my keyboard and hover over it, you can see that it returns an int. So just above in the tooltip is public final int length. An int is the data type that it returns, which is, in other words, a whole number. So let's run the application again, and you can see number of students 4, because that is essentially the size of the array. And as we said back at the start of the video, once we instantiate an array, you cannot change its value. So let's try adding, for example, another student name. So if I was to do student names 4 equals Daniel, semicolon, and I attempted to print that out. So I'm going to type new student, colon, leave a space, plus student names 4. Run the application, and you can see that we get an error. So if I go up to the top one here, Java tutorial application main, and move up, you can see that our first few printouts are absolutely fine. So we print out each of the names, the number of students, but then we hit an error, an array index out of bounds exception, as we've did before. So I can't set the name Daniel at position 4 because that position does not exist. The exception or the error happens on this line, so it doesn't even make it to line number 13. So when it hits line number 12 here with student names 4 equals Daniel, it will throw an exception, or more specifically an array index out of bounds exception. It will basically end the program there. It won't even make it to line number 13. So let's remove these two lines. You'll notice here how we have a separate system out print line statement to print out each of the values in the array. We can reduce this duplication by using a for loop. For loops are something that we're going to talk about in the next video, but I'm just going to do a quick example of one here. So between the number of students being printed out and these values here, I'm going to type for int I equals 0, I is less than student names dot length I plus plus, system out print line, value at position, concatenator, student names I plus, I'm going to remove the colon here, speech marks or quotation marks, colon, leave a space, plus student names I. And I'm going to change this to I instead of student names. What I'm now going to do is remove these 4 lines. So the purpose of using this for loop here is that we don't have to individually use separate print out statements. So if I run the application again, you can see that we're printing out each of the values at position 0, 1, 2, and 3. But we're not using separate printout statements, we're using a for loop. And this is a typical use case for a for loop, is iterating or going through every item in an array and doing something with those values in the arrays. So rather than typing out systemout.println 4 times, we've printed it out once, and we've said value at position, and this will be either 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, add the colon character, and then the actual student name. So as I said, this is an example of a for loop. I don't expect you to fully understand this right now, but in the next video we will be talking just about for loops. That's everything for this video. I really hope you found it useful. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe.